All right. Hi, everybody. It's our CFB Talk 54. My name is Bobak Hyeri, and we have a special guest today, Andy Schwarz, sports economist. And let me be clear, Andy isn't just any sports economist. He's arguably one of the most responsible for organizing college athlete publicity rights in its current state of existence, having masterminded California's first in the nation NIL bill that set the dominoes in motion. And he was co-sponsor of the bill with California State Senator, Nancy Skinner. And his views on the current state of affairs in that realm, we found to be refreshingly honest. So we invited him to come join us. So he's going to be with us in a moment. I know this is his first Twitter space, so he's going to be here very shortly. So we're just getting that fired up right now, a couple of seconds earlier. One of the things we wanted to use this space for is an opportunity to talk about how the NIL developed and what the intentions were by those who crafted it, where they are now in that space of NIL, and what the future might or ought to hold for student athletes. I also wanted to bring up some of the other things our guest has done. I mean, because he's an antitrust economist and focuses on sports litigation with work for the NFL and several suits against the NCAA. He's testified to Congress and several state legislatures and has served as an economic expert in a wide variety of state and federal litigation. He sponsored, as I mentioned, California's State Bill 206, which restored college athletes' NIL rights in California, and has been featured on ESPN, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Sports Illustrated, et cetera, et cetera. Again, there's only so much you can say. There's so much he's been involved in. I mean, what struck me was, and I see him in the audience. I'm going to go ahead and send him his invite to speak. But he also was involved in so many of the cases you're all familiar with, O'Bannon, Alston versus the NCAA, UAB's football dropping and reinstatement, Hartford's decision to move back down to D3. There's a lot of interesting aspects of that. So I'm going to go ahead and send Andy that invite to speak. So while we're waiting for that to sort out, another thing I love about Andy is he created a board game, and we're going to talk about that. It's called Envelopes of Cash, which I think is absolutely hilarious. The college football recruiting game. And we shared a tweet of that, a link to that game. It was on Kickstarter. It's already fully backed, so it's coming out. And it sounds really neat. It's an opportunity to kind of take a sort of a humorous, cynical, but at the same time playable board game regarding that. Let's see. I think we got that sorted
Test.
out.
Do you hear me?
Yes, you're perfect.
All right.
You're on right now. So that was fine because it gave me an opportunity to kind of touch on so much of your background. You've done so much in so many areas as a sports economist, but really what drew our attention was reading about the fact that how deeply involved, obviously, you were with the creation of the nation's first NIL law in California, but also your thoughts on where it's moved and where it's gone from there. But I don't want to put the cart before the horse to talk about. First of all, although I want to start a little looser, tell us about this board game. That was the thing that I realized we'd actually seen it on our CFB a few months ago. And I had not put the two and two together that you had also created the board game. Tell us about it.
Sure. So Envelopes of Cash is a medium weight Euro game. If people who know board games well know what that means. For people who don't, Euros are sort of modern strategic games that I would say have evolved out of Settlers of Catan in 1995 as sort of the progenitor of this new way of thinking about board games. They're a lot better than American style, Monopoly style board games, a lot more strategic, more thinking, but also shorter in the sense that you can finish a game in the course of a couple hours, whereas if you're playing Monopoly, you probably can't, certainly not with four people. So it involves a lot of fun, strategic thinking. If you don't know college football, you can just play it. In fact, the highest score ever recorded was 184 by a woman named Ostrid from Nordsachsen in Germany. And she said to me, I don't like American sports, but I really like your game. But if you do like college football, you will appreciate, I think, a lot of the subtleties about how the theme ties together with what you're doing, and perhaps a little of the cynicism and the humor as well. So it can play both ways. It's actually, there's three levels. It's a good game, it's cynical and satirical, and in fact, I think the third level is that really what it's saying is that this this should be a market like any other market. There's no reason why you can't commerce in the labor of college athletes any differently than you commerce in any other thing, in any other strategic board game.
So, Andy, how did you get into sports economics? Because, I mean, obviously you're an economist, and I don't know, did you start in other areas and sort of find an interest in it, or were you asked to consult on a project?
Yeah, so it's a funny origin story. The very first, well, I was in grad school. I was studying marketing, but not like marketing like how do you put bikini-clad women on cars in the calendar. More like the study of markets. How do markets work? How do firms interact to set prices? So it was in a business school, but it was a very econ focused sort of marketing, and taking most of my classes in the economics department at Berkeley. And I was 30, and my then wife said to me, when are you ever going to have a job so that we can have a kid? And it was like this light bulb went off, and it was like, probably never at this rate. So, I mean, there were other reasons too. I was pretty depressed with just being a grad student forever. I decided to leave, and I went to one of my professors and I told him I'm going to leave. And he's like, well, if you're really, really, really going to leave, then I'll give you a job. But I don't want to be accused of fishing off of the Berkeley pier. But so I said, no, I am going back to work at Hewlett Packard where I had worked before unless you give me a job. So he's like, all right, well, I'd rather have you work for me than work for them. So his name was Rich Gilbert. He had previously been the chief economist at the Department of Justice. He had recently gone back into private practice. And his private practice was, among other things, he was the economist for the NFL in the NFL's case where they were defending against Al Davis. Not the famous cases from the 80s, because I was in middle school then, but the 90s version where Davis was moving back to Oakland and was sort of trying to take just like he was still running plays from the 80s, even in the 2000s. He was running legal plays from the 80s and the 90s, and he sued under the antitrust saying that the NFL had thwarted his move back to Oakland, which was silly because the NFL was like, you want to leave LOS? Great. Go back to Oakland. We love it. We didn't want you to leave Oakland in the first place. And so Rich was the economic witness for the NFL in that case, arguing that the economics of what the Raiders were arguing wasn't an antitrust. It's not so much that it wasn't illegal, but that it wasn't anti-competitive. There's this funny thing in antitrust, which is the economists can't say what's legal or illegal because that's a legal conclusion. We're not lawyers. But the law specifically asks, is it anti-competitive? And so we can say whether it's competitive or pro-competitive or anti-competitive. And so it's almost like we can say whether it's legal or not, but not quite. So anyway, on the first day, I show up for work not knowing what my former professor, now boss, is going to have me do. And they hand me 10 depositions, big legal documents from this case, like read Bud Adams' deposition, read Pat Boland's deposition, read all these NFL owners' depositions, and also learn the economics of sports, which I had never done. So basically on day one of being a professional economist, I also became a sports economist after having never studied it before. And it was all focused on the NFL. And then I became the guy within that firm, which was a lot bigger than I would have thought. It was actually Rich was part of a very big international firm. I became the go-to person whenever anybody needed to know anything about NFL rules or the economic arguments that the NFL makes. And it turned out that people in Europe really wanted to know because when there were soccer economics going on. And so I collaborated with a guy who's now in the US, Stefan Szymanski. He's a professor at Michigan, but he was in London at the time, who is sort of the guy on soccer. So I got to know a little bit about soccer economics because in exchange for teaching him about our football, he taught me about his football. And then, so it was an accident. I'm an antitrust guy, but because sports leagues are comprised, especially prior to MLS trying to become a single entity, are comprised of independent businesses, sports leagues are always questionable. Are they leagues or are they cartels? And the law has sorted it out for the most part. But whenever you have independent businesses getting together to do stuff, it's always the possibility of being antitrust. So sports, unlike many other industries, is more likely whenever there's a concern for people to run to antitrust. So there's a heavier overlap there. And my antitrust very quickly became sports antitrust. And that's not the only thing I do. In fact, it's not the majority of the things I do, but it's the only thing that people ask me to be on Reddit about.
Andy, was your background, especially starting with the NFL and antitrust arguments, is that kind of what led you into college sports with the more recent court cases that we've seen involving the NCAA?
Yeah, so that same, I know everything about the NFL, a colleague of mine, Professor Daniel Rasher, who has been one of the primary experts in O'Bannon, Alston, and several other NCAA cases that don't get quite the same level of headlines, asked me to co-write a paper with him where he wanted to say essentially the sort of arguments that leagues like the NFL make about what is pro-competitive, what is good for the economy, good for consumers, about cooperation among teams within a league doesn't apply to the NCAA because the NCAA is not a league. The Big Ten is a league, the SEC is a league, but those leagues, when they cooperate together through the auspices of the NCAA, are a cartel. And so he brought me in part because we were becoming friends. We're around the same age and we worked down the hall from each other. But in part because I had this specialized knowledge. So that was my transition from guy who knew a ton about the NFL to guy who started to learn more about college sports. And then it clicked because I was probably more of a college sports fan than a pro sports fan, especially on basketball. At football, I'd say I was 50-50 on the NFL versus pro, but I hadn't been an NBA fan growing. Well, that's not even true. Anyway, I had become mostly a college basketball fan, and but then it clicked with me that what I had taken for granted, well, of course they're not paid, they're students, was the stupidest argument in the world. Because, well, one, lots of students get paid. And two, the reason they didn't get paid had nothing to do with them being students. It was collusion. It was an agreement among all potential would-be payers that they wouldn't pay. And that's something I understand really well because I'm an antitrust economist. And if you have a situation in which every single potential would-be payer agrees to conspire, it's a really, really easy conspiracy to maintain, especially if you can go out to the public and argue that this is noble, this is a good thing, and you can brag about your cartel. It becomes a lot easier to sustain.
This is a great segue to talking about how you got involved in the NIL space and developing it out. I mean, to say you got involved in it sounds like it already really was a thing, but you helped craft that important law in California. Could you take us through that?
Yeah, so I had been working on the O'Bannon case. The O'Bannon case started in 2009, and I tried very hard for 2 years. But the only case I think I've ever begged a lawyer to let me work on. Generally speaking, the way it works is we just get phone calls. At some point, the lawyers figure out they need us. That was the only case I've ever said, you really need to work with us. And I spent 2 years lobbying Michael Hausfeld to let me work on the case. Eventually, he relented. So I started in 2011. The case went to trial in 2014. It was up on appeal through 2015. And that's sort of when it all got decided. And we won a trial. And then the case was the remedy. What the judge said had to happen was curtailed. The appeals court limited it. Originally, after O'Bannon, there was going to be this really, really interesting economic experiment, which was that schools were going to be allowed, if they wanted but not required, to offer athletes up to $5,000 a year to be held in escrow until they finished their eligibility or graduated, whichever came first. So essentially, a 4-year player could get $20,000 a year of compensation for their NIL. And the Ninth Circuit, the appeals court for out west, got rid of that. So we didn't get to see, because if the NCAA's arguments in that case and generally were correct, nobody would do it because in their view, 1, no one could afford it. 2, athletes aren't worth it. And 3, if anyone did it, people would like those teams less. And so it would be this crazy business move where you increase the cost of your labor force and you reduce the desirability of your product. And so, if you think about it, there are businesses out there like Fair Trade Coffee is the easiest one for everyone to know. Fair Trade Coffee explicitly says, we are going to charge you more for the coffee. Why? Because we're going to pay our workforce more. And the idea is people will pay a premium for a product if the labor force is well paid. But the NCAA's argument is people will not pay a premium if the labor force is well paid. In fact, they will pay less if the labor force is well paid. They'll pay a premium only if the labor force is unpaid or paid only in kind with things like scholarships. And the moment that you introduce cash above a scholarship, demand for the product, willingness to pay, the price that people will pay will actually drop. And so as a business decision, if the NCAA is right, if I'm USC and I'm sitting in California and everybody else is just offering scholarships and I've got the opportunity, according to a judge, I could offer $5,000 of NIL money in escrow to somebody. But if I do it, for one thing, I'm going to be out 85 times 5,000. That's a lot of money. Plus, people are going to like my team less. I might get better players, right? I probably will get better players if I'm the only one offering this money. But people are going to like my team less. And so it's going to backfire on me. That's the NCAA. That is the crux of the NCAA's economic arguments, is that the reason that they have to collude not to pay athletes is because if they did pay athletes, people wouldn't buy tickets or watch on TV. And so my argument has always been, well, if that's true, it's a self-enforcing mechanism, because put yourself in the position of USC at that moment when you have the opportunity, if there's no rule. And in fact, we can think about it in terms of 2021, 2022, what's happened. If there's no rule saying you can't do it, do you do it or not? Well, if nobody likes it, if it will cause interest in your team to drop, and not just interest, but willingness to pay for tickets to drop, why would you do it? Because you're out. It costs you more and it earns you less. That's really bad business. But we didn't get to see that experiment. So that was the big tee off. In 2015, I was invited by a candidate for state senate in California named Nancy Skinner to speak at the Oakland Rotary Club. I live in the East Bay. At the time, I lived in Oakland. And so I went, and it was big game weekend, Stanford versus Cal. The Cal band interrupted my speech, which as a Stanford grad, I was not super appreciative of, but all in good fun. And I basically gave my talk about things like that, like, something along the lines of, if in fact the NCAA is right, why do we need rules? We don't need rules to prevent Starbucks from putting plutonium in the coffee, because plutonium is expensive and people don't want it in their coffee. Well, paying athletes is expensive, and if people really don't want it in their coffee, schools won't do it. And then afterwards, Senator Skinner said, well, okay, I'm running for Senate, and if I win, I might be in a position to do something about this in California. What should I do? And I gave her a few ideas. Among them, well, this O'Bannon case has just had this neat little experiment restricted. Why don't you turn it on in California? Why don't you say that if someone is in California, they have their NIL rights, that a school can't prevent them from commercializing their NIL, and essentially make the NCAA sue the state of California or whatever, or just acquiesce. And so she won. In fact, I gave $50 to her campaign, and pay for something. And somebody called me soon after she got into office, and like a legislative aide, and I spoke with that aide, and she was appalled by my idea. The aide, what? Pay college athletes? But they're amateurs. So I knew I was in trouble. And I tried to give my little spiel about how amateurism is a 19th century creation. The Greeks were never amateurs, and amateurism is, and it wasn't going anywhere. So nothing happened. So I said, well, $50 of campaign donation. I'm not the first person to be fooled by the promises of a candidate. But 2 years later, so 2019, a different legislative aide called me and said, Senator Skinner is really ready to try to do your thing now. And I was like, well, fool me once, shame on me. And he's like, no. So the way this works is that I'm a fellow. I was actually hired for one issue and one issue only, and it's this issue. So this is all I'm working on. And I am committed to the NIL concept. And so we went, and at that point, it was great. I I did not drive this train. It was Senator Skinner and Senator Bradford from Southern California. And then, but they did call on me to testify about some of the economics and help lobby. Ramogi Huma was very heavily involved. He's the head of the NCPA, which has been advocating for college athletes for at least 20 years, 25 years, I think, at this point. There was a policy group, and I think it's called Policy Org, which works for labor rights just generally. They're not athlete focused, but they saw this as an important way to remind people that this is a labor issue too. And the NCAA, they brought people in. My favorite one was Andy Fee, the athletic director at Long Beach State, who came in and said that this was going to be the death of college sports and that California was going to be cut out of the NCAA and dogs and cats were going to live together. It was really going to be a bad deal. And I just wish people would ask him about all these predictions. And then when he says, oh, well, I was wrong, I hope that people remember that the next time he predicts the death of college football because of something. Anyway, none of the threats ended up materializing. And for some of that, I think we need to give credit. California, I'm a proud Californian. It's hard for me to do this, but I think we need to give some credit to Florida. Darren Heitner and Chip LaMarca. Chip LaMarca was a state rep down in Florida, and Darren Heitner is an attorney. Took up our bill. They changed it. They changed it in ways that I think are important to talk about if we want to, but that made it a little bit less athlete friendly and a little bit more NCAA friendly. But one thing they did that was not NCAA friendly was they made it take effect a lot sooner. In order for us to get it through the very difficult legislative process in California, we had to tell one of the committee chairs who had the ability to kill the bill just by herself that we would delay it for 3 years. And actually, I said herself, but I think this particular chair was a man. There was another chair, a woman, for whom we had to make sure that colleges could not directly pay high school students prior to their arrival on campus. That was her bugaboo, and that was because her husband was a high school coach. So those were the two sort of compromises to what otherwise could have been a very, very clean athletes' right bill. There were the two spots where I was like, I don't really want to, let me step back, and I know I'm just kind of blabbing a little bit, but whenever I think a right already exists, because I think athletes already have the right to their NIL, and California was just essentially reestablishing it, making it clear that not only do they have the right, but there are going to be penalties if you don't respect it. If you have to give something up to assert a right that you already have, you're kind of losing because you already have that right. And so when we had to say, for example, that now that we were putting into law that a college could not, for example, pay for a high school student to take SAT prep classes to become better prepared to get into the college. That's now illegal in California. In order to get this bill passed, that was a step backwards. But among other people, Ramogi convinced me that was a very small price to pay to shake up the world. And I think he was right, but it still bothers me that we had to give that one up. The 3 years one wasn't such a big deal because in my mind, they already had the right, and saying that the penalties would kick in 3 years wasn't giving anything up. But it assuaged a lot of concerns in California. And the idea was it was going to give everybody space to figure this out. Well, in Florida, they're like, screw that. And I love it. They're like, let's figure it out on the fly. And they push it ahead. And I think they originally passed it to be June of 2020, but end of June 2020, it was prevailed on them to move it to the end of June 2021. So essentially, that's how we ended up with July 1 of 2021 being this magic moment when everything changed. And in the interim, then, the Supreme Court ruled on the Alston case, which was appealed only by the NCAA and could have been left alone. But the NCAA thought they were going to be successful at the Supreme Court. They lost 9-0, and like a week before that deadline. So when the deadline came and the NCAA had been just about to essentially impose a lot of what I would argue probably illegal rules, certainly anti-competitive rules. I can't tell you what's illegal or not. They had been reminded by the Supreme Court that when they do things that are anti-competitive, it's potentially illegal, and that they don't have special dispensation from the Supreme Court to do whatever the hell they want in college sports because of a revered tradition of amateurism. And so they just let it happen. And so we've had this wonderful economic experiment for the last more than a year now. I don't know about you, but for me, my interest in college sports has not flagged at all. I am really, really looking forward to this upcoming season. I think I see evidence that lots and lots of people are doing the same. I would love to hear what the people on this call think. Is there anybody who's like, I just hate sports now that athletes can earn money from their NIL? Because that is not just hate, but won't watch or will watch less. And not just like a feeling, but like, are you really going to act on it? Because that's essentially the arguments that the NCAA has made. To date, like last year, people were getting NIL. Ratings were up, not just versus COVID, but versus pre-COVID levels. And people seem really excited about football. So I think, the arguments that I have been making with Dan Rasher back since that first paper that he asked me to write with him back in 1999, I think this experiment is proving them to be true. And I think, more importantly, like there was an internal logic to what we were arguing. And there was a complete lack of logic to the NCAA's argument, which is that, one, nobody wants to see college athletes paid, but that if they were allowed to, everyone would do it. Those are inconsistent. That's like a Yogi Berra, like no one goes there anymore because it's too crowded. And it's funny to say those sort of things, but they don't make any sense. And when your logic doesn't make any sense, it's probably because it's bullshit. And so, I don't know how interactive we want to be, but I would love to get feedback from people. If you believe that, one, everyone's going to do it, and two, no one's going to like it, like walk me through why that's going to happen.
Andy, you'd mentioned the example of, I think you said like plutonium in coffee. It's something that nobody wants and that is going to cost more.
Yeah.
Does it help that, talking about college sports specifically, there's been so much public outcry for, having the NCAA video games come back. And there wasn't a way to do that without finding a way to pay players for their name, image, likeness in some form or fashion. Does that help in your mind with the push to get NIL legislation passed? Because you can point to it and say, look, the public very much wants this, and it's not actually going to cost the colleges any money to do it because it's going to be money coming from the video games.
And I would go one step further. It's going to make money for the schools because the schools had to give up money when the video game went away. Certainly, it's a great example of what I would say is the contradiction in the amateurism argument. The amateurism argument is that by insisting on amateurism, schools make more money than if amateurism is not collusively enforced, but only enforced by schools' own choice. Meaning, there's nothing in the arguments that folks like me are making that says Notre Dame has to pay anybody. Notre Dame, if they want to be out there offering scholarships and cost of attendance and NIL and not paying salaries, can do that. Now, if USC, I keep using USC. I have no affiliation to them, but they're, as a out of conference rival of Notre Dame wants to pay salaries, they're probably going to beat Notre Dame for recruits. That's a market choice. That's the kind of market choice that firms in markets face all the time. Pay less, get lower quality. So, but if it's important to Notre Dame philosophically not to pay, that's one thing. Because if anyone's going to argue Notre Dame can't afford to pay, they don't understand money. Notre Dame can afford whatever they want to pay in this market. The ability of Notre Dame to generate revenue from football players exceeds the cost of those football players. So it's a taste, T-A-S-T, taste argument. Like, it is unseemly, in our view, to pay this much money. Economics, and especially antitrust economics, doesn't care about your feelings in that sense, doesn't care about what you think is seemly or tasteful or decorous. Your decorum is not important. Marketplaces are supposed to be rough and tumble. And so if the argument is, well, it's not gentlemanly for us to compete on salary, that's not going to get you very far in this world. So to go back to what you're saying, yeah, the amateurism rules killed a successful product. It took commerce that was vibrant that was meeting consumers' demands, that was making money for school, and it led to that product disappearing from the market. That is the essence of what we would call anti-competitive, because it reduced commerce, it reduced output, it lowered welfare. Welfare in the economic sense means like happiness. It lowered lots of people's happiness and profits. Like it's the worst outcome possible, all in the name of preserving commerce under antitrust laws. So it's ass backwards. And yes, if we allow NIL, we get our a happy product back. So it's a great example of why reaffirming an existing right that should have been there all along, that was there all along and should have been respected, is also pro-competitive, because it yields more revenue for schools, more pay for athletes in the form of royalties, and more pleasure, more utility, more welfare for consumers. And so that's sort of the goals of antitrust law. Basically, the big three are: you want more. Unless we're talking about a labor issue, and so let me put that aside. But if we're talking about an output issue, we want lower prices, more output, and better quality. And right now, when you have a product that's unavailable, it's sort of the same thing as saying the price is infinite, because there is no amount of money you can pay to get a new college video game. So right now we have infinitely high prices, we have zero output, and we have zero quality. We have the worst outcome. And in a year or two, we're going to have a moderate price. We're going to have lots of output. We're going to have high, like decent quality, decent prices, and lots of output. It's going to be such a better outcome. And so, yeah, this is the perfect proof of why competition, not collusion, is the way to a market where more people do better. It's a capitalist sort of like case study dream.
Andy, I just want to say we're enjoying this conversation. I want to just let you know, respecting your time, if you have more time, because there's a couple more.
I have plenty of time. If you talk
perfect.
to an economist and you expect short answers, you don't know economists.
Oh no, I was thinking, because I'm an attorney in my day job, and I was just like, oh my gosh, you're a great expert. these would be delightful things to sort of have these kinds of explaining everything, giving the background, and making the point. But one of the things that
if we had prepped for Depo and you said I want short answers, I would be like, yes. No.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, please no. And then next thing objection to the form. What as one of the people who crafted the NIL as we know it, and I think that's easy to say. Do you feel where we are now? Because I know when you hear people describing what NIL is on the radio, they're kind of almost retconning it. What was the intent, and is that intent being honestly talked about now?
Yeah. So, I mean, my intent was, as I described it, was to create a marketplace in which athletes could go to schools prior to enrolling and say to the school, not just to a third party, will you pay me for your use of my NIL, and how much? So that among the things they could consider in choosing a school, what's the education like? What's the athletics department like? What is the position coach going to be good for my career? Is the strength and conditioning coach good? How much money am I going to make? And so that was very explicit in there, so that schools would compete. And again, with the possibility, not a very strong one, but with the possibility that the NCAA was right and that schools would say zero. Why zero? Because if we give you anything, our fans will root for the other team and they will stop paying for our tickets and we won't make any money. And then we can't pay for all these lavish facilities because our donors base will dry up. But thinking with 99.9% probability that was not going to happen. And that in fact, it would prove the correctness of my argument. So when the idea was given to Nancy Skinner, and when Nancy Skinner was pushing for it, it was very, very explicitly about competing for high schoolers, schools competing for high schoolers. And if anyone doubts it, go look at the arguments that were being made about why it shouldn't happen. The NCAA was saying it would give California schools an unfair advantage because they would recruit better. And if this was only supposed to apply to people once they got to school, it wouldn't have affected the recruiting. Like this idea that, oh, this is really only supposed to be, rewards for people who are there, or, upperclassmen, or there's a lot of arguments that I hear that says that essentially what we need to do is make sure this is not an inducement to attend a school. And if you go back and look at the O'Bannon case, which is all about NIL, and again, that was sort of the reason why I suggested it was because the O'Bannon case had been curtailed at the appeals court level. We made the argument, and the judge explicitly talked about it, is if you take away from the athlete the ability to market, to put themselves on the market prior to committing to a school, you take away their maximum point of leverage. That is the point where their NIL is worth the most. Once they get to the school and they are captive. Now, I know the transfer rules are becoming sort of loosey-goosey, and that's, it might be, oh, well, you can transfer any minute, but especially historically, it's been quite difficult to transfer. It's a lot more difficult for an athlete to command the maximum value for their NIL because they can't take advantage of competition. Because once you are at Alabama, you can only compete among Alabama-oriented businesses. But when you're pre-Alabama, you can ask essentially Alabama businesses to compete against Auburn businesses. And it's a very different environment. If there's only really one major car dealership group in each market, that's not the case. But oftentimes there's like the big gym. And if they want to hire you to be the spokesperson for the workout center of, I'm the quarterback who represents the workout center of Tuscaloosa, they kind of can give you a take it or leave it offer. But if they're competing against the workout center of Oxford, Mississippi, and Starksville, and working their way through all the SEC towns, it's a different competitive environment. So was that in my mind that should be a competitive environment or a monopolistic environment? I'm an antitrust economist. Of course I wanted it to be a competitive environment. Was that in the mind of Judge Wilkin when she issued her original injunction in O'Bannon? Yes, she says that explicitly. And so the NIL movement, which was trying to replicate what she had set up in O'Bannon and that was taken out of it, the Ninth Circuit, very much explicitly was saying athletes should have the ability to take advantage of their maximum point of leverage. And the same thing is true if athletes want to transfer. Now, I think a well-reasoned NCAA rule that makes the argument not about the scholarship payment, but about playing time, that limited when you transfer, how often you can transfer and then immediately play, I think that it could be crafted in a way that would pass antitrust muster. So I know that recently there was a proposal that athletes could transfer like infinitely and every day, and it was recently not shot down. But the fact that it was proposed shows me that I think that people are like both scared and also not really thinking about antitrust right. Because I've also heard people say things like, oh, well, antitrust means if everybody in the NCAA agrees, the FBS schools agree. But if only the FBS schools agree about football, that's a monopoly. That only the FBS schools agreeing about football is no different than the NCAA agreeing about football. The fact that that the non-FBS schools are not participating in an agreement about FBS rules does not somehow magically immunize you from an antitrust problem. You still have 100% of the FBS schools making rules about FBS. It's a monopoly. So, I feel like, I don't know if anybody who's listening to this knows the song work of Jonathan Richman, but there's a line in his song, Here Come the Martians, where he says, where's their financial advisor? Somebody should take him by the hand. It's like, where's their antitrust advisor? Someone should take them by the hand, because it sounds like they just aren't really talking to economists about this, or maybe even lawyers. They got to imagine they're talking to lawyers, but are they talking to contract lawyers? Because I feel like antitrust lawyers would tell them, guys, that's not how it works. And so I forget where we started on this, Jag. But,
we were kind of talking about how the intent of folks like yourself moving those initial NIL rules, because it seems to be, to some extent, I know people are out there trying to tell you that this was always supposed to be about running a camp and signing autographs
for people who are already committed to a school and not about creating a marketplace where athletes could essentially say to a school, where do you want me to be signing my autographs? Who wants my presence on your campus? And who wants my presence on your campus is a very valuable thing. And that was always the intent.
So when we look at the NIL space now, and we've basically completed sort of that freshman year of it, has the space been sort of, I mean, because I wonder how much of it are people who are truly looking out for the students in this, and but rather the opportunists and frankly charlatans who are just trying to cash in on this new space and this new money that's being thrown out there towards students. Is that a concern that you see when you look at how the NIL market is developing now?
Oh, well, I think you and I have. Whenever you have a new market, whenever you have a gold rush, there's always going to be people rushing in to take advantage of a gold rush, right? The analogy I used before is the East Europe right after the wall came down in 1989, and a ton of young Americans flooded into places like the Czech Republic, and many of them went there because they wanted to make East Europe better. And some of them went there because they wanted to get rich, but getting rich might have also helped make East Europe better. And some of them went there because they didn't care whether they wanted to scam people. But I think that's always the case. I think so I'm not going to say that I think that everyone should be very leery if anyone tells them that they are here to make them rich in a market, because, the world is filled with scam artists. Get a good lawyer, get a good financial advisor, find somebody who will take a small percentage, read the fine print carefully. I wish that the NCAA had embraced the idea and was offering free services. We're going to vet people for you. We're going to offer up finance professors from business schools. Like, there's all sorts of things that a athlete-focused organization that thinks that it's out to serve the interest of college athletes, which I don't know, like based in Indianapolis, could do to really help weed out the problems. But I don't think that the fact that there's going to be there's grift everywhere. I just think that we're better off having the free exchange of ideas. And the more we can do to help, especially because some people in this market are underage, the high schoolers, and even the ones who are 18, they're very young. A lot of people in the college sports space come from families of very low means. So the kind of money that we're talking about is not second nature to them. So in some of the state bills that got passed, there's a real paternalistic element. In order to do this NIL stuff, you have to take 3 hours of financial literacy. And it really, at one level, bothers me because I feel like there's almost like punitive element to that. Like, oh, well, screw you. We're going to make you we don't make anybody else do this to get a job, to get a modeling gig, to get a influencer job on Twitter, on Instagram. But on the other hand, I kind of wish that everybody was forced to take 3 hours of financial literacy at age 18. So it's like a bad reason, but a good outcome. And so it would be great if whoever the new president of the NCAA is, when that person comes in, when I fantasize about it, that person just says, you know what? We're not about cartels anymore. We're going to embrace this new world. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to help prevent the scam artists. And we're going to teach everybody how to sniff out the grift when they tell you that they're going to take 65% of your first 10K of earnings, and then you find out that you're only going to make 10K. So they're getting 65% and you're getting 35% or whatever.
That's been kind of an interesting juxtaposition, hasn't it? With, we hear people that make the argument of, oh, well, it's not that I mind athletes getting paid, but, 18-year-olds shouldn't be making this kind of money. And then at the same time, we can say, well, if you go from high school straight into the pros for baseball, because they actually let you do that still, you can get, millions of dollars in guaranteed money as a signing bonus straight off the bat. But
Yeah,
if
Kyler
you
Murray
chose
did
to go
that.
to college first, then instead, that same, player the same exact age who chose to go to college instead of go to the pros, you're not allowed to take any money because you're not financially responsible enough for it. So there's been that kind of, weird example of, direct comparison, people the same age, when we say it's okay, when we say it's not.
And we don't even say it's not, because by law, it's totally okay. It's just people out there pontificating about paternalism. And I get it, because I'm old and I have kids who are in their 20s, and they aren't as smart about money, and they all differ. All three of my kids differ in how they handle money. And I understand how easy it is to be paternalistic, especially when I am the pater of the three kids, but about kids in general, about young adults in general. But that's not an excuse, I think, to break the law and to impose one's personal sense of like, these kids are too young to have this kind of money, which is a opinion, as a like, so therefore I'm going to agree that you and I, neither of us are going to pay them, right? Like that's the difference. I don't think these people are smart enough to have it, is one thing. So therefore, when I make my contracts with them, when I discover by not offering them enough money, I'm not getting any good talent. So when I do make deals with them, I say things to them like, I really want you to put some more money into a 401k. We have a policy that says we sign you up for the 401k and you have to opt out of it if you want to. So therefore, some of your money, like we do all these nudge things. To nudge is like a econ theory, Cass Sunstein, where we make it harder for you to get the money in hand and easier for you to save it. Things like that, which are paternalistic in some sense, but are designed to help humans avoid their tendency to spend and their difficulties in saving. So, but that's, and then the person can choose. Well, do I want to work for a company that's going to be a little bit paternalistic and kind of force me to do good things with my money, or do I want to work for the company that trusts me, but then I might spend it all before and not say, okay, well, this whatever. And so like that was a little bit incoherent, but the point here is that yeah, we can all feel as old people that young people are irresponsible with money. And some of it is probably stereotypically true in the sense that like it's true for 80%. But stereotypes, even if they are statistically true, aren't generalizable to everyone. And certainly not a good reason to take away people's rights. If we want to pass a law that changes it so that adulthood starts at age 25, that's one thing. As long as adulthood starts at age 18, those 18-year-olds should and do have the same rights as the 21-year-olds, as the 55-year-olds. And if coaches have the right, then the 18-year-old adults should have the exact same rights. And that's essentially, people say to me, well, when are you going to be happy, Andy? And my answer is always, when an athlete can do exactly what a coach can do.
Well, Andy, that's kind of a final question. What should the future be or ought to be for student athletes when it comes to their rights and financial compensation?
Yeah, so there is no reasonable explanation for why college sports is amateur. There could be a perfectly fine reason for why a conference is amateur. And the difference there is that college sports is a national thing. If you want to run a small conference, like something like the Ivy League, maybe even two Ivy Leagues, size, 16 schools, and argue that your product is different from other products and that there are plenty of options for athletes outside of your conference, I think that's fine. But if you want to argue that the entire system has to be amateur or else no one will watch, I think the burden should be on you to prove that. And I think the evidence is really, really, really strongly against you and is getting worse for you every day as we see the changes in major college football happening without impact to interest in sports. If, in fact, as on a relative basis compared to other forms of entertainment, college sports is becoming more popular as athletes are being increasingly compensated. So I think the The long-term future for college athletes should be that they are free, with one exception, to interact with their universities exactly the same as professional athletes. In fact, be professional athletes. And that one exception is that a condition of their employment, if they're employees, or their condition of engagement, if they're not employees, is that schools can and should require them to be enrolled students, because that is the differentiation of college sports from professional sports. What we call professional, but let's call it major league sports now, is that college sports are played by college students, and that the mythos that has been erected that what makes college students is that they aren't paid is a sleight of hand. What makes college athletes is that they're college students. They're students, but student and college, there's nothing to do with whether they're employees of the university. I bet you many people who are listening to this or who may read a transcript of it afterwards were employed by their university. One of my roommates worked at the library every summer at school. He was an employee of Stanford University, and he was a student at Stanford University. And no one ever said that his being an employee of Stanford University made him less of a student at Stanford University. It's just not true. And so if we can get away from that intentional conflation of student and employee and think about the studentness, are you really a student? Do you really go to the school as what distinguishes college sports from other kinds of sports? Then we can really have an open, flexible thing. So then, like I said, I think then it can allow for reasonable transfer rules, because it's very hard to be a real student of a school if you're transferring every week. So oh my God, if everyone can transfer every week, then it's like there's no one will know who's on the roster, and it won't be any, like, yeah, that makes sense to me. And it also makes sense in terms of defining the product as being a real college student, because real college students don't transfer every week. And so having reasonable rules that ensure the collegeness of the product, I think, will pass antitrust muster. And especially if they're done conference by conference. And those conference by conference rules won't probably put conferences at a strong disadvantage versus other conferences, whereas pay rules would. If one conference says we're not going to pay athletes and another conference says they will, the one that won't is going to be at a strong disadvantage, and we'll see that conference lose out. So the short version of that is, if we focus on what makes college sports great, what to some people makes college sports better, which is that these are real students, like this is about college, and strip away all the other stuff, I think we can have a world in which athletes are able to exercise their rights and fans are able to get what they want. Really great, every day should be Saturday sort of world. There will be changes. We'll have California schools in the Big Ten, but we're having that anyway. That's really not the athletes' faults. That's the school's faults. But we can have a world in which athletes' rights are respected and college sports remains distinct without the calamities that the same people who told us that NIL was going to kill college sports are predicting for all the other changes that they're predicting, because they're horrible at predicting. My favorite quote of any Californian is from Upton Sinclair. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. It is difficult to get anyone within the college sports space to understand that paying athletes does not destroy college sports when their salary depends on college athletes not getting paid. So in cash, they're paid. So anyway, there you go.
Well, Andy, thank you so much. This was one of the most intriguing, conversations we've had. I mean, I learned a lot listening to your expertise and your background as a sports economist and going into the college sports realm, from that origins in the NFL to the college sports antitrust to going into the NIL area, and all of this on where we are now and where we could head with it. I really appreciate the time you gave us this morning. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And people should go and buy envelopes of cash.
Absolutely. Yes. And We will share a link to that. We'll share a link to Envelopes of Cash. It's exactly as it's spelled. There's no trick to it. A new board game that Andy's already developed. The Kickstarter already is through. It's coming. It's going to be launched. It's already a guarantee. So on behalf of all of us, we just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. Again, this was our CFB Talk 54. We had Andy Schwarz, sports economist. Thanks on behalf of all of us, Sirius, JD, who couldn't make it, and of course our guest, Andy Schwarz. So now I'm going to hang up and listen.